In the 30 years before 1975, two wars were fought on the sliver of Southeast Asian coastline known as Vietnam. The first war was a struggle between Vietnamese nationalists and the French colonial regime. That ended in 1954, with Vietnam split between the Communist North and the pro-Western South. In the second conflict, known as the Vietnam War, the United States replaced France as the chief Western power arrayed against the communist regime of the North, headed by Ho Chi Minh. Ho, supported by China and the Soviet Union, had successfully ousted the French and was prepared to fight a protracted guerrilla war against the South and its American allies. As part of a foreign policy that sought to contain communist advances, U.S. President John F. Kennedy increased the number of U.S. combat advisors to more than 16,000 by 1963. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, capitalized on a North Vietnamese attack on a U.S. naval ship in the Gulf of Tonkin to escalate U.S. involvement in August 1964. Within a year, Johnson and his advisors were ordering heavy strategic bombing of military targets to check North Vietnamese advances. On the ground, U.S. troop levels increased dramatically, ostensibly to protect air bases. That role would widen as the war persisted. Viet Cong forces engaged in classic guerrilla warfare. They avoided conflict except in advantageous circumstances, melting into the jungle or the civilian population after an attack. Troops and supplies infiltrated through Laos and Cambodia along a network of jungle trails named for Ho Chi Minh. Low-intensity actions such as assassinations and terrorist activity made it impossible for conventional U.S. and South Vietnamese troops to attack the unseen enemy. By late 1967, the war had evolved into a stalemate. North Vietnam sought to take advantage with a series of bold attacks on southern cities that began on January 30th, 1968, and coincided with the Lunar New Year called Tet. Viet Cong troops attacked Hue, Saigon, and other population centers, winning a propaganda victory, if not a military one, by the time attacks ended 3 weeks later. The Tet Offensive and anti-war sentiment at home forced Johnson to turn over responsibility for ground combat to the South Vietnamese. This policy became known as Vietnamization. President Richard Nixon continued Johnson's policy and ordered a steady reduction in U.S. ground forces. To keep pressure on North Vietnam even while withdrawing troops and seeking peace, Nixon ordered bombing raids on Viet Cong supply routes and sanctuaries in neighboring Cambodia in 1970. As peace talks continued in fits and starts, both North Vietnam and the United States engaged in major military actions. In spring 1972, Hanoi launched a major land invasion of the South. In December, the United States began massive bombing raids against the North's principal cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. After the bombing ended, the two sides resumed negotiations. The Paris Accords, signed on January 31, 1973, led to a complete U.S. withdrawal and the return of its prisoners of war, but little else of benefit to America or its ally, South Vietnam. 2 years later, North Vietnamese troops swept into Saigon. In the course of the war, more than 2 million people were killed in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and the landscape of Southeast Asia was devastated by over 3 times the total bombing of all of World War II.